Well, Kelsey and Ariel, thanks for joining Roger and I as we sit down. And we were just going to talk about women in leadership in the church. Maybe we should invite some women to come talk about women in the church. Not really. We weren't really going to do that.
Make it real.
But I appreciate you guys sitting down, and I appreciate your candor already in our conversation. But for our watching and listening audience, who might not know as much about your backstories as we do, what has been your experience leading in the church, right? Because, you have the name pastor in front of you, but there's more to that story, and you do not yet have the name pastor in front of your name, but there's more to that story too. So,
she's my pastor.
So,
official title. Yeah.
So, what roles have you guys filled in church world, and kind of how's that story developed?
Go ahead, Kelsey.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ariel. So I grew up in the church, and so a lot of my, obviously I'm a worship pastor, and so a lot of my background is mostly to do with worship, but there are the few other things in there. In high school, I was the president of our youth. We had a Stuco group, and so we kind of planned things, and we're kind of the way that it's set up in a high school, just for our youth group specifically. And so
sounds like you may have grown up Southern Baptist because the word president was just thrown around.
I know it. Chairman, is that what we like to use here?
No,
chairman.
I'm just
Chief. Yeah. But that was also in a team situation, so it was a female and a male. And so that was...
Intentionally? Was it intentionally?
I believe so.
Okay.
I could be completely wrong. I'd have to ask.
But your perception, at
But
least.
my perception of it was that it was intentionally a male and a female. And
shout out to Justin Grissom.
Yeah. He was my counterpart, for better.
Justin Grissom name drop here.
Right. And then eventually, as I led worship for the youth, that kind of turned into leading worship in different situations, be it in a church or as part of college groups, different things like that, and kind of led to me leading part-time for a couple of the different campuses of the church that I was a part of at the time. Eventually, as I grew, God started calling me much more into vocational ministry, a little harsher. I was not listening so much because, quite frankly, I didn't think it was going to be a possibility for me to find a full-time job as a female worship leader and or pastor. And so that kind of turned into me looking for part-time situations and then kind of doing something that would be more sustainable to make a living. And so, but God very quickly and harshly closed those doors after we paid a lot of money for me to get gen eds for nursing school and things like that. But the Lord moves, and so
those are the best life decisions. The one that cost a lot of money,
right? And so eventually, I became the office admin, which I do think is a leadership position in quite a few different ways. And then I took that knowing that I was going to come here and become the worship pastor at Arise. And so, which has become sometimes a preaching role against my fighting.
I want everyone watching and listening to know that the draft of responsibilities that I have always had for Kelsey's role includes a statement, meaning she was always eligible to preach. But we disagree on this.
He's very wrong about that.
We disagree on this.
I would like to see this.
Yeah. I also think that he's edited it quite a few times.
It says, and other Sunday morning duties as necessary. And to me, as someone who preaches on Sunday morning, that seems like it might
I don't
fall
feel
in
like
purview,
it said that. I feel like it said something along the lines of other Sunday mornings pertaining to her.
But I am happy to submit to my sister in Christ and admit that she might be correct here.
I'm not. Well, actually, I am, because now I've preached, 3-4 times? Something like that. So that's my background. I now currently serve as the worship pastor. That also includes, just because it came up in conversation earlier, small group leadership.
Yeah.
So on to you, Ariel.
Oh boy.
I can't wait to hear this. I don't feel like I know your story.
I mean, it's not really exciting.
It's riveting.
It's
riveting.
a nice one.
It's what?
I love your story.
I don't even know what you guys are talking about. Shoot, I feel like maybe I have a different story than.
Well, I didn't tell you that it was going to be a good story.
What is my story?
What have I told
forgot.
people? I don't even know.
Who am I?
mean, I guess when I heard this question, the first that I thought back was high school. Like I would lead a group of high school girls co-lead. Actually middle school girls while I was in high school. So I did that for a while. And then.
And you were a PK when you were?
I was a PK.
All right.
For
people who
don't know, that was
okay.
preacher's kid.
Yeah.
Yes.
Our pastor's kid. I mean,
Yeah, our pastor's kid, whatever. However you want to say it.
Not priest.
I was going to say
Not
that, but I was like,
priest.
you're right. That shouldn't happen.
Pastor, priest.
Not priest.
That's a
Let's
whole,
get technical.
Whole different thing.
whole different thing.
Yes.
Different
totally.
podcast and film for a different time.
Yes.
Oh no.
So I did that for a while, and then after I graduated high school, there wasn't a lot of college-age people at my church, so I tried to start a college group there, which was pretty successful for maybe a year or so, and then you know how college kids are, you just kind of fizzled out. Greg and I got married, and then once we started having kids, I went to community Bible study. And was kind of corralled to be a leader there, a children's teacher. And so I was in Leaders Council, which is a lot more fancy than it actually is, than it sounds. And then from there, we started going to Rooftop, and then I started teaching kids there. And then got an email from Jacob a couple Octobers ago and was like, hey, we're doing this series on women in the church. Do you want to come and share a message? And I was like, do you know whose email this is? Like,
You got us on the same series.
You have the right
I knew whose
email
email that was.
address. And so I went, and it turned out to be really good and felt like, oh, maybe this is what God has wanted me to do. I've always wanted to go to seminary. I've always loved theology and a lot. But I mean, I kind of had the same thing as Kelsey. I'm like, oh, if I go to seminary, what am I going to do?
Right.
Like, I got 4 kids who need braces.
Right.
Like, nobody is going to pay a woman, you know, to come and do any kind of preaching or teaching or anything like that. That's changing a little bit now. So, yeah, that's basically where I'm at right now with learning how to do it better, continuing to learn more about theology and stepping out and stuff like that. So, very boring.
Not the word I would have used, but so you guys both have some leadership ability, including leadership experience, rather.
Yeah.
Including preaching. What's that been like? Right? Because when I get up and preach, right? When I grew up in the church, right? I was never a PK, but grew up in the church. Our stories are parallel, and I know Roger. This is true for Roger too. Mm-hmm. Lots of parallels. Grew up in the church, you know, always involved, always doing things, and then just like one day I got up and preached, right? But when I got up and preached, no one was questioning, is Jacob fit to preach? When Roger got up to preach the first time, no one's like, why is he up there, right?
Right.
I imagine that hasn't always been the experience for you guys. So, like, what's it been like as a woman leading in the church?
This is really interesting because me and Kelsey, we've had this conversation before. Like, just knowing that, like, how much she's been working towards this, or you know, there's been something that she's wanted to do as far as pastoring, leading music, leading worship, and again, like she was saying, not knowing if that was a possibility. Yeah. And you know, again, I've felt some calling to preach and do that as well. Mm-hmm. And again, lucky enough that when Jacob, when he emailed me, I was like, oh, okay, thanks. Like, I wanted to do that.
Was that for the Women in the Church series?
Yeah.
Too? I just really didn't. I wanted to plan this series, but apparently not.
No, his was the one after.
Oh, the one after. Okay.
Yeah, he was the one after.
You were Gospel John.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we talked about that, how like there was really just this brief window where I was like, man, I really like to do, like, I would like that opportunity to get on stage and see if this is something to see if this calling that I feel is accurate. Mm-hmm. But it was extremely easy for me to be like, hey, Jacob. And not saying that Jacob is like this, but, you know, it was easy to be like, hey, you know, can I get up there? Can I give it a shot? You know, can we see what would happen? And like you said, you know, you go up there, no one really thinks about it. I wasn't like, oh man, I really hope that people can see me as this, you know, person who's giving them the word. I wasn't worried about people being like, oh, why are you up there? Yeah. It was more like internal, like, can I do it? Let me see if this is right. Mm-hmm. But obviously, like Jacob was alluding to, that has to be a different scenario, like a different situation for you guys. So it is crazy that happens.
Yeah, it is. What was
Go
the
ahead.
experience like for you?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Trying to pass the buck a little bit.
I just talk, so it's your turn.
All right. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, my first time preaching was at a church where I'm already called pastor, right? So I think that's a little bit different. But I do think, I think there was a little bit of this fear of kind of coming into it of like, is this going to be taken seriously? Is this something that I think that was the biggest question. Is this going to be taken seriously? Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think especially coming from, situations beforehand. I mean, for me, I think, I grew up Baptist. And so, I'm not going to speak for every single Baptist person out there, but I think universally I can say that mostly, that is a complementarian and Southern Baptist at that. So a fairly complementarian place. And so, it was interesting because when I started leading worship in youth, I didn't really know much about it. Didn't really think much about it at all. It was just kind of something like, oh, they like my voice. I play the guitar. You should probably lead worship. And so that was kind of where it felt like that was a lot. And so I didn't really experience much of the, I guess, gender repercussions of it until I started leading at a particular campus. And I didn't know it at the time, and none of these people specifically spoke to me. But I was told a little bit later as we started asking, like, why weren't these people coming back to church? And that a lot of that was because we now had a female leading worship instead of a male. And so at first I was doing a lot of leading, but I was helping someone, and that person was male. And then I came in as a female worship leader, and that was a much different situation, right? And so I think it's kind of always this like, okay, so I guess kind of having to like gird yourself in a little bit of like what kind of things are going to be said? How am I going to have to defend this, right? Like, I think that's one of the very first things that comes into my mind when I know that the elders are going to stand on stage at State of the Church, because I always feel like someone's going to end up asking questions about women in the church. Or at least for our first one, I was like really nervous about that. And I was really nervous that like, as at the time, the only female elder, right. I knew that this wouldn't happen, but I was a little nervous that it was going to be like, everyone look over at me and like, what do you think? I'm like, oh, please don't make me answer this question because I feel like I'm going to be snarky. Right. So it's this kind of feeling of almost having to defend what God is calling you to do. And so I think the more discouraging side, and we were talking about this earlier, is that at times I think it's this kind of fear or this feeling that a lot of people think that maybe the work that God is calling you to do specifically for you is either like, my first thought was like derivative, like this doesn't matter as much, but then it kind of comes into less of a derivative, like less of that word and more of like, this is sinful. Mm-hmm. You're doing this and it's sinful. Mm-hmm. And so, which I think, that's kind of where she and I have talked a lot about mm-hmm. this, that like, I don't think that this is a moral issue. Mm-hmm. Or at least
specifically, what is not a moral issue?
Women leadership.
Leading. Okay.
Yeah. And so, and like biblically, I don't think
so. Not even just preaching, just like leadership in general.
Leadership, I would say. I mean, I would go as far to say like preaching, elders,
sure.
and various things like that. But I think that's kind of, and then of course there's just like the awkward times, right? Like I went to a conference that was put on by a specific worship, a fairly famous worship team, and I came in and I was one of the few. There were a lot of females there. But there were very few female worship leaders. So like everybody was like wearing their title. Are you part of a worship team? They had different workshops for that. And so there was a women in worship workshop. And then there was like these other things like leading your team, band development, like those kinds of things. And that was the one that I chose to take. And several people came up and said, oh, the women in worship is down the hall. Oh, the women in worship is down the hall. And they're like, oh, are you here with your husband? I'm like, no. My husband doesn't play a thing, at least at the time.
My husband works for me.
Yeah, now he does. Yeah.
So there's still that stigma.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think I think for me, that's the thing. I would never say that it's been bad. I don't think that anybody, there are little comments that people make, like maybe you should focus more on your children or other various things. And like, that's a frustrating thing because I don't feel like anybody would say that to a male unless like they were actively not caring for their children, right?
No one's ever told me that in my life.
Yeah. And so like that to me was fairly frustrating. And so that kind of thing.
Yeah. I did have somebody tell me that one time. I was talking about going to seminary and what my plans are, and he said, "We have a lot of kids at home, and your husband works full time." And I was just like, "Yeah, I'm aware of these things, and my husband is. I'm home all the time, so of course I understand." Yeah, and I'm like, he is very supportive, and we work it out and stuff.
Shout out to Greg Stephens.
Shout out to Greg Stephens.
Shout out to Greg Stephens.
Roger loves
Roger
you very
with the
much.
Bromance.
Bromance. I can feel it. I can feel his love for you, like radiating from across
emanating
the table right now. So big and fluffy. And of course, it's really hard. Like for me, it's really hard to stay calm, and that was in that situation.
Yeah.
Because it's just I knew this person was a complementarian. Meaning that they believed that only males should be leaders, women should be staying in the home, women shouldn't be teaching men, things like that. And so it was hard. It was really hard to keep my cool. Just because, like you said, I feel like I have to defend what I think that the Lord is asking me to do.
I think that's it. It's the constant feeling of having to defend it and the constant feeling of having to have, we're like, I speak for myself, but I think I can speak for her too, like super happy to be a part of this conversation, but like the conversation in general of like having to defend the stance of like, why God called it. I don't know. I didn't sit there and say, God, please put me on stage.
Right.
Like, that's not something that I even like to, like, I don't like being on stage. It's like, I don't know.
If our first question was, why are you a woman in leadership in the church?
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's a different
This
conversation.
conversation is significantly more frustrating. But it is, like, I think